Hello, listeners. Welcome back to another episode of the Untethering Shame podcast. As we close out our summer re-release series, we're ending with one of the most transformative conversations we've had on the podcast. Over the past few weeks, we've revisited episodes that invited us to pause, reflect, and return to the core of our shame resilience journey, reconnecting to our values, confronting old narratives, and exploring the parts of ourselves we often hide. In this final re-release, I sit down with trauma-informed educator and leadership coach Lena Papadopoulos to explore the shadow self, those hidden parts of us that we suppress because of shame and societal pressure. Together, we dig into how the shadows form, why we fear embracing them, and the ways it shows up both personally and collectively. We talk about how compassion becomes the bridge to integration and how doing our own shadow work is deeply connected to collective healing and liberation. This conversation is an invitation to bring curiosity and courage to the parts of yourself you've tucked away and to remember that your wholeness lives in the places you've been too afraid to look. Well, Lena, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. I know we were chatting a little bit before we hit record about how interesting it is to be having these absolutely universal, necessary, and evergreen conversations. Like when we talk about the shadow self, this is never going to be a topic that isn't relevant to be talking about. But how interesting the timing is that we're recording because there's so much happening in the world right now that really showcases even more the importance of having these conversations and the sort of multitude of layers of the work. And I think for many of us, we can get confused by there's so much individual work, but there's collective and communal work, and there's this interplay between those things. And so I'm curious if you could just start us off, because when people hear the shadow self or they hear anything with shadows, I think there's sort of a distancing. People are kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of weird. Sounds a little like, like what's going to happen? I feel like people are paying me to like read a Ouija board. Like, what does this mean? It's a little weird. It's a little creepy. Can you help us understand that and why we need to be talking about it in the context of shame?
Yeah, so there is definitely a lot of kind of misperception around the shadow. I think people do associate it with something dark, with something bad, just because of the word, right? And our cultural connotations with things that are shadowy. But really, in that sense, it's parts of self that are hidden from view. They're kind of like, so far under the surface, we're not aware of them. They may be beliefs, aspects of identity, of self-concept, patterns that we kind of operate in that we're not consciously aware of, because to be aware of them would imply that we have to confront or face some kind of pain. And that pain is rooted in shame. So the shadow is created through the experience of shame, of having someone judge or criticize some part of you that makes you then feel like, oh, I'm not lovable. I'm not wanted. I don't belong. I don't fit. And so those parts of self, they often become pushed down. And this is something typically that's happening right in early childhood. So we're pushing these parts of ourselves down. We're kind of molding ourselves to fit into the expectations of the outside world. And then we're just disconnected. We're disconnected from those parts of ourselves. And we're not even really aware that they're there. And so it's through this process of shadow work that we're really peeling back the layers and illuminating these things that have become hidden so that we can become aware and integrate what has felt shameful into the wholeness of who we are in a way that we're working on dissolving and shifting the shame.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, I think so much of my experiences and my understanding of shame, I'm now trying to witness through my almost 5-year-old and watching how she is developing her sense of self. And of course, there's like layers to this. There's my own shame that I'm trying to not pass on to her, that I don't want her to have, as, for at this point in time at 5, she pretty solidly identifies as a girl. She's like very confident and comfortable in that. It's much more likely that that will be how she identifies in the world. So I'm raising a young girl and I'm like, fuck, okay. I have all my own shame that I want her to like not have. But then I also have the shame of like, I have to be the perfect mom, which means I have to make sure that she never has anything that happens. And when I'm able to step out of those two things for a moment, I can witness what you're describing, which is this sort of her trying on or sort of showcasing different parts of herself. And then the way that she responds, or that the world responds to her, I suppose, dictates how much she takes that with her. So I've seen these, and in this instance, it's like, this thing, if everybody laughs, she's going to keep doing it because she thinks it's funny. Like it's much more surface. But I think about, as I got older and did my own unpacking, most of the stuff that was sort of buried in the shadows, I was never conscious that I put it there. I didn't necessarily know, like I recognized like, oh yeah, I always thought this was a problem or people would think these things, but I was never just like, well, here's the day I consciously put it in the back. And so is this a protection mechanism that our body is doing? And how do we, if it's a protection mechanism, what's it protecting us from?
Such a great question, because I think we're wired for connection and belonging. And it's so important for us to feel accepted. So that's one piece. But then also there's this other piece of need and survival. And, especially when you're a child, you are dependent on the adults in your life to care for you. And so their expressions, their opinions, the things they say to you, they literally represent life and death for you. You're like, oh, they don't like that. I can't ever do that. I can't ever do that. I will lose love. I will lose safety. I will lose security. I can't ever do that thing that they don't like. And so that's part of why we're not really remembering, right? Because usually this shaping and molding is happening at such a young age, and we're doing it to ensure that our needs are met and that we're safe and we're cared for and we're loved. And so it is definitely a protective mechanism. And that's why even as we get older, when we do have the courage to start to confront some of this stuff, it can be really unsettling and uncomfortable, because it brings up those feelings of, oh, but like, this is a part of me that's not okay. And if I start to show it to the world, I will experience loss and connection. I will experience rejection. It's just like this threat to our sense of safety and security, and also who we believe ourselves to be.
Yeah.
Because we very much create an identity around who we feel we have to be versus who we truly are.
Well, it's interesting because as you're saying that, I'm thinking about, the moment that you perform and you sort of elect that route of performance-based identity, which everybody does it. Like, I think people hear this and there's this like, I shouldn't have done that. Why did I do this? That is we need, like you said, connection and belonging. The surest way to secure it is to act like everyone around you, to conform, to fit in. And when you grew up with caregivers, not because they're terrible and they're the villains of the story, but caregivers doing the best that they could, probably thinking that love was conditional because that's what they were taught, and that they're teaching compliance because compliance feels safe. There's this sort of domino effect of like, okay, this is the surest way to gain security. And the tricky part, at least for me, is I think about the moments where I didn't tell my friends in high school I actually hate country music. I pretended like I liked it because they all wanted to listen to it, and I listened to it in the car. The short-term gain outweighed the long-term negative to me because I'm just in the moment. My brain is like, how do I make sure that right now I'm okay? And so oftentimes the suppression, the dismissal, the pretending, all of that, there is an immediate gain, which I feel like makes it even harder than to one, acknowledge that there could be a long-term detriment, but then two, to even care about that, because you're asking me to think about something 10 years down the road, but like right now the threat is here. I can't tell my husband that I actually have a preference to go to a different restaurant. That's a threat. I can't do that. I've got to suppress this part of me, or I can't wear the clothes that I really want to wear because everyone else thinks that this is cool and fashionable. The threat's right now. It doesn't matter that 10 years down the road, I'm going to have the confidence to be my authentic self, or I'm going to keep dressing like everyone else. Right now, I just need to secure it. And so how do we break that? Because to me, it feels like then it keeps our brain sort of hyper-focused on the reactive next step, and the like compounding of what goes in the shadows is based on, well, here's the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And we're not even thinking about that big picture until we reach some sort of breaking point. And then, we call somebody like us, be like, what the fuck do I do? Everything is terrible and I don't know how to function anymore.
Well, first of all, I was just laughing because I used to lie. I used to tell people that I was allergic to ketchup because I didn't really like to eat it with food. And they thought it was so weird that I was like, well, I'm just going to tell them that I can't eat it. Like, it's not even a choice,
Oh,
gosh. Yeah. I mean, yeah, because it's like, God, you're going to make fun of me because I don't like ketchup. So I'll just lie and say that I can't even eat it so that you won't bother me about it, I think we do become almost like so hyper attuned to other people's responses and reactions. And so, like, as you were talking about this kind of compounding effect, it's like we don't even realize it's happening. I mean, of course, with this example, it's like, I'm making a very conscious choice to lie about, But in a lot of cases, it's happening in such subtle ways that it just becomes almost like wired into the way that we're relating to the world and to the people around us. And I think this is why there's just like such a problem more collectively too with this kind of disconnection from self that I think is then reflected in the division between us, because it's kind of actually so normal to be disconnected from yourself. That is what happens through the process of social and cultural conditioning. Is like we're really being molded and shaped to kind of fit into these very specific boxes and ways of being that make other people comfortable. As you said, it's just being passed down. So I was having this really interesting conversation last night, and I think it really kind of exemplifies kind of how this can play out collectively as well. And so I was with this group of women, and some of them were sharing, how they had been criticized as kids for being too sensitive. And so how they were kind of shutting down their emotions, but they were being criticized by people who had shut down their emotions, right? Yeah. So the people telling them you're too sensitive are the people who are having a hard time connecting with their emotions. Then there were a couple of women in the room who were being criticized for being too cold or uncaring, because they had caregivers who kind of would dramatize things and go into these emotional spirals. And because the child didn't go there with them, then it was like, oh, you're cold, you're uncaring. So it's like the judgment and criticism that then leads to shame is really a reflection of the shame of the person who's judging or criticizing. And it's because your difference forces me to confront something I have shame about. And because I don't want to look at that, I judge you instead. I make it about you. Yeah. So the sensitive kid is showing this person who's disconnected from their emotions this disconnection, but because they don't want to see that disconnection, they tell the child, you're too sensitive. Yeah. You should be different. Right. You should be more like me. And the same is happening with the parent who doesn't know how to manage their emotions and then is telling the child, oh, you're cold and uncaring. And I think the way that I can see that collectively is yes, we can speak about a general sort of, let's say, anti-transness, because a trans individual represents this kind of outside of the norm of the binary, of the duality that we've become comfortable with, that feels like a social norm. So they're representing in some way the choice to be free in their self-expression. Mm-hmm. And that's confronting to people who are so bought into this kind of binary way of existing, this norm, that something outside of that feels like a threat. And rather than me confronting where I am not giving myself the freedom to express all that I am, and maybe some shame that I have experienced around gender, mm-hmm. I will just treat this difference that I perceive as a threat. It's really an avoidance of looking at myself, mm-hmm. is to just put it on someone else.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think about, I can't remember I think it was Harvard. It was Princeton. There was a place that made the implicit bias test. So I remember doing this in college, and you're obviously always going to be, it's like when I did a Cosmo Girl quiz when I was a kid. Like, I'm always going to want to get the answer to be that I'm mm-hmm. clearly this version, whatever it is. But the way that the test is written mm-hmm. is you really can't. Like, it's really designed in such a neutral way. And there's so many nuances to how we'll read a question based on our biases that it will then be able to more accurately showcase where those biases mm-hmm. exist. And you can see it's scalable. It talks about sort of your range and like how biased you are towards certain things. And I remember doing it and having such a rejection to this idea at the time. It was around, the big one that I remember was around thinness and about likely what would have been labeled as fat phobia. We weren't really using that word a lot yet, but being like, I'm going to be a therapist that works with eating disorders. I am not fat phobic. I believe all of these things. And it's like, the idea that there was something in the gray, I had to reject it because it felt like if I am not this and clearly this without any sway whatsoever, then I'm a shitty person. If I expand that thinking even more, I think about how binaries become something that we cling to because we almost need them because it's this thing showcases and gives me mm-hmm. this sense of self. And it has to be this way. There can't be a gray because if there's a gray and there's nuance, there's fear. There's all this potential mm-hmm. of, well, what does this mean? And what does this mean? And I think a lot of it is this idea of self-reflection, of thought, of mm-hmm. willingness to be curious. You know, fast forward a few decades, and as we saw a lot of talks around racism expanding and this idea of like everyone's racist, and what they were basically trying to communicate is that mm-hmm. everybody exists on this spectrum. It has nothing to do with your identity. You might be a great person. You're still a great person that has bias. And I feel like there's that piece of it that comes into play where some of the things that we stuff down aren't even necessarily, okay, well, this part of me is perceived like I like, you know, rap music, my friends like country music, but things like, I don't want anyone to know that I actually have a bias towards thinness because I have to be this like very liberal, mm-hmm. inclusive person that wants everyone to have a place. And that understanding that both can exist is really tricky. A trans person has every right to exist and be in their own free space. And it's not just a threat to you and your identity, but everything, if it's down to the binaries, everything becomes a threat and a defense. And I think that's what we're seeing so much more in our culture now, where it either feels like you have to pick one side or the other. There's no room for gray, when in reality, my assumption is probably 98% of us actually live in the gray between those two ends.
Yeah, exactly. That's something I say all the time, is that I feel like part of the reason there is so much division and polarization in the world is because we don't know how to exist in the in-between. Because the uncertainty creates insecurity, like you said, right? There's like a lack of safety with the not knowing, or maybe not even the not knowing, but like, yeah, just the unpredictability of it or whatever it is. It's like we cling to something that feels like, oh, this is concrete. So it's like black and white. Oh, those are like two opposites, right? It's concrete. I get it. I can hold on to that. But then it just obviously creates like, well, yeah, if it's not this, then it is this. And so it's implicitly this versus that, me versus you, us versus them. Then everything is this binary of like right and wrong, good and bad. And the truth is that all of life is really existing in this gray. It's just that the gray creates discomfort. So we push it away. It's just like the same thing that we do with the parts of us that go into the shadow. It's too uncomfortable to look at it. So we don't.
Well, and I think what you just said, that's so interesting when you said uncertainty equals insecurity. I think that is such an interesting point to just call back on, because I think we're talking about that, but maybe drilling into it a bit to see, in this instance, it might be the uncertainty in terms of some position you take or some identity or some larger societal issue. But we're also talking about the uncertainty of, it might not be that everyone's going to make fun of you because you don't like ketchup or you don't like ketchup on your chicken nuggets or whatever. But some people will. And so the unpredictability of what's going to happen, I want to avoid that.
Yeah.
I want to avoid, because our brains, and I think because you said we start doing this when we're so young. Like my 5-year-old is just starting to understand a little bit of nuance. That's not how their brains are wired. It's all or nothing, good or bad, right or wrong. And so if you've been doing this since you were that age of very concrete thinking, knowing that your fear brain doesn't give a fuck about nuance. Your fear brain is like, is this safe or not? I want a yes or no answer. If you start to code it in fear, there's no option to explore the nuance anymore. So then, like you said, it's not this or this. It's not this and this. It's this versus this. This is good, bad, right or wrong, safe or unsafe. And I think that experience of safety is what I'm seeing being a discussion we need to have as individuals, to think about that conformity and sort of stuckness and comfort is not the same as safety and security. This performative security is not actual rooting. And then on a larger scale, how this fear of what safety could or couldn't be, and our inability to sort of reconcile the fact that, again, everything is nuance, prevents us from having these conversations. It's not safe. It's not safe to say, I actually don't know what I think. Or it's not safe to say, if we gave the example of the election, maybe someone is like, I couldn't tell people, I actually think they both weren't great candidates, because there's no way I just have to pick a side. And then this represents everything about what I believe. And again, that's then what's going to secure me the greatest safety, security, and belonging.
Yeah. And even you just mentioning elections, like that kind of process of appealing to the masses, that's why so much of it is geared toward touching on people's fears, because you want people to make decisions based out of fear, basically. And when we're in a state of fear, there's a part of our brain that shuts down, the part that actually can comprehend and understand nuance and complexity. Like it's not working anymore. Yeah. And I mean, I feel like there's so many ways in which our society, our culture, like feeds on our fear.
And even seeing, I've been struggling with this one a lot lately. I started to struggle with this the first time that Trump was in office. I was pregnant with my daughter and I was getting the 23andMe scan because I don't know who my father is. So I had my mom in my life, but I don't know who my bio dad is. I didn't know any information. I'm like, I should probably know, like if I'm a carrier of some of these big diseases, whatever, before I have a kid. I also was curious, what's my racial and ethnic background? Like, I don't know anything about this other half of me, and I don't look like the rest of my family. And so really trying to figure out these pieces. So it would have been in 2019 that I got the results, and I found out that I was 51% or something like that, which I think probably those few percent in between is like some random, we can't totally tell, but half. My dad was clearly full Middle Eastern. And like through more matching and typing and all of that, over time, I learned that I'm Iranian. This interesting thing about the freedom of this information in a culture where that felt unsafe, it immediately became a part of my shadow. instead of a part of self-expression.
Mm-hmm.
And so just noticing when we think about, because I want to talk about the ways that it stops us from, setting boundaries with our in-laws and doing this, and it stops us from speaking up at work. But I do think because we're here thinking about the broader perspective of systems of oppression, do I believe that people of color should be treated equally and given the same opportunity? Do I also think we need to acknowledge the fact that it's really fucked up what's happened in our culture? Absolutely. And then on a survival mechanism, I'm scared of what that means to claim that identity for me based on a person in a system in a position of power and control and what they might do with that. And I've had to work really hard at taking that out of the shadow because, again, the context of safety and security, I don't feel it about something that I deserve to claim and have be a part of me. And so I think about that now, even in the layer of the privilege that I have the ability to put it there, but also in this sense of, again, based on the world around us, the parts get labeled as a means of protection. And I feel shame even saying that out loud, but it is true. And I feel fear about that. And those are the things that I think keep those systems of oppression in place, is the fear of ultimately our own individual survival, because we do think of the collective, but at my core, I'm like, but what the fuck? I don't feel safe for me if I do this.
Yeah. What was coming up for me as you were sharing about that is a little bit about my own family's history. And so both of my parents, all of my grandparents, everyone's Greek. So I know, I'm very clear, but they're also Greeks who immigrated. Well, immigrated is maybe not the right word, who fled genocide that was occurring against Christians in what is now Turkey, following the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. And so there is really this kind of us versus them narrative between Greeks and Turks because of the history. And there's a lot of fabricated history also that we've been enemies since the beginning of time, which is totally not true. But this is how people are kind of taught to think about the other in school. It's part of curriculum. And my grandfather, his dad's family was all murdered. And he had walked by himself as a child from what was Anatolia to the north of Greece, where my family kind of all lives now. And so he just had this deep-seated hatred for Turkish people. And when I was a graduate student, I studied conflict and war, but specifically how it's related to religious identity and how religion plays a role in national identity, because Greeks are statistically 98% of Greeks identify as Greek Orthodox, while only half or less actually identify as religious. So it's very much just a part of this is who I am as a Greek, but not really part of a belief system. And that has been concretized, amplified by the fact that people in Turkey are Muslims. So it's very much about an us versus them. I cling to my Christianity because you are Islamic. And so, when I was studying this, I was very interested, okay, I've heard all my life these stories of how horrible Turkish people are. And I'm curious, what's the other side? Because there is for me, there was this clinging to this victimhood. And I was I'm sure that we have, we're not fully innocent in all of this. And so I did some really deep dive research into all of that and found out lots of interesting things about the ways in which Greeks oppressed Turkish people or oppressed Muslims, or so deep into this us versus them, we're good, you're bad, we're the victim, you're the perpetrator. And what I have realized in the last year even was that my desire to reject, this is some real shadow stuff. My desire to reject that narrative of victimhood was actually rooted in my familial experience, because my dad and my grandmother are people who they're just always victims. They treat people like shit, but they're always the ones who have been wronged. And I see in me this inclination toward victimhood. I do that too. And so my kind of like rejection of this cultural narrative was really about a rejection of my own propensity to play the victim, which is rooted in my like disgust of my dad and grandmother playing the victim. But it's like, it is something that I definitely have this almost like natural relation to the world of like, oh my God, like they hurt me and they did me wrong. And wow. Like I definitely do that. But it was like, I wasn't able to see that because it's something that's so activating for me because I disliked it so much within my family. But the reason I disliked it so much within my family and within this cultural narrative was because it's a reflection of something I don't like within myself.
That is such a powerful example that bridges the gap on, I think I counted 3 layers, but there's probably more. And there, again, we're in the gray somewhere, some sort of nuanced number of layers of work where it's seeing this global piece. And it wouldn't just be between Greeks and Turks. Like we see this across the board. I took a forgiveness class in college and I remember talking about my professor who worked in South Africa during the forgiveness courts, you know, and all of these pieces where you think about apartheid or you think about slavery, like there's always this like groups that are fighting or people that have oppressed or hurt other people. And there's this like take a position and we have these reactions to it. I think you did something really interesting by exploring it. And it probably, my assumption is it was more accessible on the global scale for you to think about these things. And then only because you were willing to kind of do that introspective work could you connect it back to, oh, fuck, like this is actually not just about this like aspect of my identity, but this is these like intergenerational transmission of viewpoints and trauma and ways of engaging in the world. And I have been, the weird part is, you have been wronged by them constantly taking a position of being wronged. So there's like this kind of like layering of that and then never wanting to put that on someone else and also not wanting to take a powerlessness position. It's kind of what I'm hearing. And so I think this is such a natural and beautiful segue for us to think about how the shadow self, like some ways that it's showing up for us in our individual lives. Because you brought this example, which is a part of you that you probably consciously actually still would like to keep in the shadow. Like you don't want to be this person. You don't want to have that thought process and a conscious choice of how do I show compassion and love to that part of me? How do I integrate that into me? Because I think a lot of times when people get to the place where like, okay, shadow work makes sense. They think it's always about things like the ketchup or the country music or like letting your authentic self shine. And it's these beautiful parts that everyone's actually going to celebrate. It isn't always that, but it is this curiosity of the full self and the integration of all of the parts of self. So can you give us maybe some examples or some ways that you might get someone to start thinking about how their shadow self might be, like what parts they've put in the shadow? And then what do we start to even do with that once we're aware that we are doing those things?
I love that you brought up this piece around the compassion, because I feel like that's really what shadow work is about. It's about creating an acceptance of yourself and that self-protective role. How do I want to say this? Like that the fact that you put some part of you in the shadow, that was a self-protective process. So let's have compassion for the version of you, the younger part of you that needed to do that to be safe. And so when I'm working with people, when we're doing shadow work, the first step is really like identifying the shadows. So what has actually been pushed down, cast away? And some of the questions I ask are actually about like, well, what do you most judge in other people? What do you most criticize in other people? What really annoys you about other people? And it often turns out that like, as we're going through the process of shadow work, it's like, oh, those things are what are in my shadow. So one of my recent clients who's only 20 years old, and like, God bless her, she is like just amazing for having gone so deep into this work. One of the things that were coming up for her was she's like, well, I hate when people play the victim. I hate when people don't take responsibility for the ways that they hurt other people. I hate when people like try to have power over other people, like when they manipulate people or situations. And through the process of shadow work, what she came to understand for herself, like through my support, but it was really, she's the one who had the realization of the way in which I try to maintain power in relationships is through manipulating people's emotions. And then I avoid like taking any responsibility for that. And then I think that somehow I've been wronged and I actually am the victim in the situation, even though I have manipulated them and done them wrong, but I've done it in a way that makes me look like I was wronged. And she wasn't aware, right, that she was doing that in any way because it was so unconscious. And so then we look at like, well, what's the origins of that? Like, how did you develop that kind of pattern as a way to stay safe in whatever environment you were in? And it was very much about this like hyper attunement that she had to caregivers who, in the situation she was in as a child, she literally was a victim. She really was. It was unjust what she had experienced. And so what she was actually doing was continuing to kind of enter into the same kinds of dynamics, but trying to play a different role. So she's trying unconsciously to resolve what was happening for her as a child, right? Like to let's reach a different outcome. And so then, okay, well, it makes so much sense. Like there's a part of you that wants to feel like to have somebody acknowledge that the way you were treated was wrong and unfair. And you're trying to create that outcome for yourself. Like, of course, let's have so much compassion for that version of you that needs to feel a sense of justice, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think the really interesting thing that I've learned, I mean, obviously we're always more critical. I mean, I guess I shouldn't say obviously. The majority of people are more critical of themselves than they are of anyone else. And our stories are so much, our expectations are so much bigger. Obviously, there are times where people take the opposite approach and they do that sort of deflection. But I think the thing that I've had to really grapple with my own self-forgiveness, with forgiveness of others, is that most of the people in my life and most of the interactions that I have had in my life, good, bad, neutral, didn't root in a place of malice. There wasn't an intention to hurt and to harm. And I think the judgment then when we look at ourselves, because as you're describing your client, I was like, fuck, you're actually describing me when I was in my 20s. Like, is this a weird time travel moment where it's actually me working with you back then? My husband used to call it the spin zone. Like he would have any concern or anything that would come up. And by the end of the conversation, he would feel like the biggest piece of shit because I knew how to make it go back on him. And that was protective. But the shame for me would come from once I realized I did it, I would equate that to a character in a story that's like the narcissistic villain. And I couldn't understand that those behaviors were, they hurt him. And I needed to be able to make space to hear that and to take responsibility for that. And to hold space to know that that was never my intention. And that doesn't make me a bad person. And I think that part is really tricky for us to not, I don't think synonymize is a word, but synonymize our behaviors with our identity. And I think the compassion piece comes more when you can be like, yeah, those behaviors are like kind of shitty and fucked up. And I don't like that. I'm also not that person. And I think that's a really tricky distinction for many people trying to build any sort of openness and curiosity, because the automatic thing is like, oh my gosh, you were gaslighting your partner. Like you're a terrible person. You're a narcissist. You're probably manipulating this entire interview to make it look like you are a certain way when in reality, you're just like psychotic and like have no ability to engage in the world with any real connection. And so that part feels really important. How do you help people draw that distinction between, as they do that reflection, it's okay that these behaviors are things you don't like, and you as a person, like you said, of course you had to do this for survival. Of course your brain is making sense of this way. But adding in that third piece of, and you're automatically going to dump on yourself for it, that doesn't mean that that's fair, valid, or rational to stay or exist in that place.
Well, that's the thing about shame. It's almost like taking on this identity of defining yourself as someone who is bad, not like someone who does a bad thing, but someone who is innately, inherently bad. That's what shame tells us. And so by really looking at where did these patterns come from, what purpose have they served? And in what way is it no longer serving you? Actually, in what way are you being limited or held back or just almost like trapped through the repetition of these patterns? We start to identify too, like, okay, well, what if I were to relate to a situation from a different place, like choose to engage in a different behavior? What would that look like? How could I go about things differently? What could I actually do? And we identify different sort of practices. So I frame a lot around practice. It's like, okay, well, this is something you practiced for a really long time. And now it's almost become like second nature to the way you operate. But we can practice new things until that becomes the way that you operate. And these new things are reflective of what you truly care about, what really matters to you, the kind of person you do want to be in the world, the kind of reflection of the kinds of relationships you do want to have. So it's like, I really try as best I can to kind of separate the action from the identity. And through the process, we're also working on that person's self-concept. So how are they thinking about themselves, viewing themselves, talking about themselves to themselves, and reframing inner dialogue too. So it's just like, I think really in so many ways, it really is this process of like reorientation. Like, this is how I've oriented to myself and to the world up until this point. And if I want to orient to myself and the world in a different way, what kind of shifts need to happen? Because it's like, I'm not that behavior. I was just doing that behavior without even knowing it, because it served some purpose. It did serve.
Yeah. And I feel like, as we sort of bring this to a close, the big thing that I'm taking away from what you just said is how that process of shifting into the gray, into the nuance, into the kind of openness, that uncertainty of what our life is going to look like, but that sort of attunement to who do I want to be and how do I want to show up, allows for more grace for ourselves to recognize that I am not the same person as my 20-year-old self, that maybe it did engage in some of those behaviors. There's also some behaviors that I have that I still don't love, that I'm working on letting go of. And there's some parts of me that I know are still in the shadow that I have not brought to the surface yet. And I haven't figured out what that next step is to bring the love and the grace to those parts. That's what I'm working on. And so that sort of iterative evolution of the self, I think, gives so much more grace to also then see that if we're time stamped by our worst day or our worst period in our lives, how hopeless is that? And I think that creates hopelessness in the world around us. And so there's a balance of responding to people around us based on who they are, but to also have hope that there is the ability for individuals and collectives to make and see change. And that piece, I think, is really the gift that you're giving. And it allows us to not get so fixated on, fuck, I yelled at my kid today, I'm a terrible person, I did this, and like getting so caught up in this one moment, and instead allowing this grace and space to be like, yeah, I did do this thing today. I am worth more than my behaviors. Also, I get to choose what this looks like. And by asking some of these questions. It's how do I want to orient myself to my life tomorrow, to my life a week from now? How do I want to position it? And so I'm curious because I know there's a lot of people that are like, all right, I'm in. I need to open the door. I need to do the shadow work, and I need to know how to connect with Lena because this is who I want to do this with. Can you tell us where we can find you? Where's the best place for people to get in touch with you? And what does that first step look like for them?
Honestly, I think the best way to get in touch with me is to send me an email. And that is Lena@LenaPapadopoulos.com. And I'm sure you'll have, the spelling in there for folks because my website's under construction. I kind of have moved away from social media. So yeah, I think email is the best way. And then, I do have information about the process that I can share with people, but I'm also so happy and open to have a conversation too, to answer questions and talk about the process and how it unfolds and the steps we go through, because it's actually very structured. There's a lot of space for flow within the structure, but it is a very delineated process of steps that we go through.
I love that. And I think the idea of, for some people, it's the let me lay it out. Here's exactly what you buy. Here's exactly what you do. Here's how this will be. What you're describing is this notion of this work is very nuanced, just the same as that's the whole theme of this. This isn't just here's this one package and this is what I do. It's let's start a dialogue to figure out what this process looks like to you individually, which also creates that buy-in for each of us to recognize what's on the other side of that work. And again, this isn't a one and done. It's not, do these 6 steps, everything's solved. It's recognizing that iterative movement towards freedom. And for me, it's this authentic self. I've also learned that the more I do this work, the more accepting I am of other people who think and feel differently than me. And the more willing I am to embrace the idea that I don't actually know much of anything other than I'm not the most powerful thing in this world. I, as a human, am a part of something so much bigger. I have no idea if what I'm doing, thinking, feeling, believing is right or wrong. I just know that it is. And allowing that to happen. And I think that has really come from my willingness to do this shadow work. Listeners, I know I say this every episode, but I genuinely want to make sure that you hear it this time. Come back to this episode a few different times in different states of being. Maybe even now, we're recording this in February 2025. The world, I don't even know how I would describe it right now. The world is uncertain, just to use a word that we already talked about. And there's a lot of fear and a lot of chaos that has existed throughout time, but it feels very pertinent right now to address and to acknowledge. And so what can we do? How can we deflate the fear in the way that we're showing up? How can we do the work that we are capable of doing? How can we reflect on ourselves, on the world from a different and more nuanced perspective to allow the capacity to build hope for our own lives, to not feel stuck and overwhelmed, for the communities we exist in, for the world at large? What does that look like? And so come back to this episode and please go to the show notes, connect with Lena. Even if you're I'm not ready for that one-on-one conversation, it's a little too scary or I'm a little unsure, just seeing the things that she's putting out into the world, to keep having those invitations come your way so that when you're ready, you have a safe, secure person you can reach out to. As always, please share this episode with someone else you think could benefit from hearing it. If you want to stay in the know on everything with Untethering Shame, make sure you hit that subscribe button. And of course, if you leave us a comment, let us know what came up for you, or if you have questions, it allows us to even know how we can better support and serve you. And as always, those 5-star reviews are greatly appreciated. Otherwise, we'll see you back here next Sunday.